More than half of the European pilgrims died in their first year due to poor nutrition and inadequate housing. The native inhabitants, the Wampanoag peoples, welcomed the visitors. They taught the Europeans how to plant local crops such as fish and to tap maple trees and hunt beaver. And this enabled the immigrants to survive the first year and to thrive thereafter. These pilgrims shared a meal with the Native Americans in the fall of 1621, establishing the basis for the Thanksgiving holiday. The U.S. economy was built, at least in the southern colonies and states, around agriculture. The slaves were the primary source of physical labor on the plantation. Initially, Native Americans and poor Europeans were brought to work the land, and they were indentured servants who, after a period of time, paid off their debts and were free. Some of the Native Americans were slaves, and sometimes the slavery lasted their full lives, sometimes it was only some years. But their children were free. However, the Native Americans tended to know the land better than the Europeans and tended to run away and so didn't make really good slaves. So they were eventually replaced exclusively with Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved in America. On the farms, they mainly engaged in planting and harvesting cash crops such as rice, cotton, wheat, sugarcane, and tobacco. Right before the Civil War, the U.S. South produced 75% of the world's cotton. And they enabled industrial activity in the northern states. You know, some people think, well, you know, that the North didn't really participate in slavery, but they benefited with the cotton gins, the Wall Street, New York, the trade, all depended on many of the cash crops that were that the slaves raised. So the African American slave skill development was limited to the trades. There were some like blacksmiths and other trades, as well as agriculture. As you know, it was illegal to teach the slaves to read or write. In the early statehood, subsistence farming was dominant prior to and during much of the American Industrial Revolution. And this really got started in the 1793 in the northeastern states with the cotton mills. However, it wasn't until the mid 1800s, the early 1800s, that it reached its heyday with the increase in slavery to provide the cotton. So, but the advancements in farm equipment and technology led to fewer and fewer farm hands needed on the farms. And as U.S. industrialization continued, the work for the rural farm workers declined. Americans moved more to urban areas looking for factory work. So between 1910 and 1920, there were more urban residents than rural residents. In 1865, right before the end of the Civil War, Union General William Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, which declared newly freed slaves to be promised 40 acres of land and a mule as reparations for slavery. They were planning to have they were planning to divide the 400,000 acres of land that was formerly owned by Confederate landowners off of the eastern coast of the U.S. of North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and some of the other low-lying area was going to be set aside for the newly freed men. This was land that was formerly owned by Confederates, and obviously before that was a traditional Native American land. So this would have provided a number of the slaves the opportunity to own land to become economically self-sufficient. However, what happened was that President Lincoln was assassinated, and the new president, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern sympathizer, canceled the special field order and the reparations idea that went with that. The promised acreage was retained by the white landowners. So without land or skills, many freedmen had few options to sharecropping on white-owned land. Many factory jobs were not open to African Americans or other ethnic minority populations. And then there was a lot of discrimination in both practices and laws favoring the landowners, and they saw many of these sharecroppers were chronically indebted to the landowners themselves and the local merchants. So some of the practices included higher rent, higher interest payments on loans for equipment, for seeds or fertilizer. The rents that they charged were very, very high. And then the laws made it difficult or illegal to sell crop harvest to anyone besides their landowner who severely undervalued the crops. So therefore, the sharecroppers were not able to get out of debt. So the current health system has a number of other inequities. The inequities continued after this sharecropping and can continue into today. But the inequities are not only in raising the crops, but also in food, the food itself. Many Americans suffer from food insecurity. Food insecurity is the lack of access to sufficient food for an active, healthy life. 14% of all households, 20% of African Americans, and 22% of Latino households face food insecurity. So that means that that at some time during the year, that people can say that they're not sure of where their next meal is coming from, when they're going to be able to eat next. That's food insecurity. And food insecurity can also be underconsumption or overconsumption. Malnutrition, which leads to obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. In fact, in food insecure neighborhoods, the diabetes rates are 50% higher than they are in other neighborhoods. I think a lot of people are familiar with the term food deserts. These are areas that lack access to fresh, nutritious fruits and vegetables. Oftentimes, these are low-income urban areas. However, even though there aren't fresh, nutritious fruits and vegetables, there are low-cost, low-nutrition, fast food, processed food locations where the food has more fat, sugar, and salt. But agriculture also affects climate. 9% of greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture. And 52% of methane emissions are from agriculture, mostly from cattle and other livestock. The digestion process creates gas that's given off by livestock. And 84% of nitrous oxide emissions are from agriculture. And these are mostly from the fertilizers, the artificial fertilizers that are put on the land to grow crops. Agriculture is very energy intensive. 17%, it accounts for now for 17% of fossil fuels. It's also very, very water intensive. Globally, 70% of water use is from agriculture. And this water use intensifies any droughts that could be caused by climate. Climate change also affects food directly. In addition to affecting agriculture, it affects food production, food processing, and food distribution. The crop yields are reduced by heat, by drought, by floods, by extreme weather. For example, in 2020, there was a major derecho in the upper Midwest that was one of the billion-dollar disasters for that year. You know, in 2020, obviously, we had more billion-dollar disasters than ever before. But one of them was a derecho. What is a derecho? A derecho is a straight line wind. You know, instead of where the winds are at the speeds of tornadoes, they can be 80 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour winds. And so they destroyed the crops in the upper Midwest. Warmer temperatures also lead to fewer chill hours. Those aren't the hours that you spend in front of the TV. Chill hours are the hours that nuts and tree fruits and avocados need in order to ripen. In order to grow, there has to be some time where the temperature is cold, and so those are called chill hours. The ozone that we talk about, the ground level ozone, not only affects humans and causing respiratory problems and heart disease, but it also affects soybeans, wheat, oats, green beans, and peppers. Heat stress also reduces milk and egg production. Heat stress to the cows reduces milk production, and to the chicken, to the egg productions. Carbon dioxide reduces the protein and the micronutrients in barley, soy, and sorghum. And of course, micronutrients include things like calcium, zinc, and iron. Climate change also affects fish and seafood. There are new fish kills from algae blooms. We also see fish populations are declining due to ocean acidification, due to carbon dioxide and carbolic acid that's produced from the increase in carbon dioxide. Drought also prevents streams spawning for fish that need to swim upstream to reproduce. The contaminated shellfish also is more common due to floods and the flooding of the shellfish beds and contamination with sewage that can overflow during the floods. And we also see contamination during algae blooms. We also see coral bleaching and other issues that are due to the warmer water. Now, these are problems for everyone, but indigenous populations oftentimes are more affected by climate change. They are more likely, and it affects them differently because they have more of a traditional spiritual connection with nature. So unlike the Western culture where we, the Judeo-Christian culture, where we say that we should be there to dominate nature, a lot of indigenous peoples believe that they are related to nature and that there is a caring type of responsibility, like you care for your children and your ancestors and your and elders. So many Native Americans and Alaska Native cultures include subsistence hunting for game, and places like in Alaska, they gather berries and they still, eat the berries that they gather. We also see subsistence farming and fishing. So sea level rise threatens the freshwater and the saltwater fishing habitats. The sea ice melting threatens the Alaskan fishing, and it also, and the permafrost melting threatens transportation, housing, water, and fishing. So the U.S., in order to regulate the food industry, the U.S. relies on the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a primary piece of legislation that drives how farming is done here. It was enacted by President Roosevelt as part of the New Deal in 1933 to keep prices fair for farmers and consumers, to ensure adequate food supply, and to protect and sustain the natural resources. The bill is updated about every 5 years and consists of 12 titles. So it consists of a lot of different programs to regulate food production and availability. They regulate commodity crops, which are crops as defined by the Farm Bill itself. They're often non-perishable, able to be stored and transported. The federal government controls the supply of these crops, making sure that there are enough of these crops, but not too much. They protect farmers' incomes for this, and the goal is to make food cheaper and more plentiful. The top three production crops are now corn and soybean. I think corn and soybean account for about 70 to 80% of all crops in the United States. We used to say the waves of wheat and grain, that those aren't produced anymore in large quantities in the United States like they used to be. So how are these crops used? Corn is primarily used as a U.S. feed crop. 95% of grain fed to animal feeds is corn. Corn is also used for a number of other products, such as cornstarch, high fructose corn syrup, corn oil, alcohol, and ethanol for gasoline fuel. So the demand for fuel ethanol led to the increase in acreage use for the corn crop. And ethanol was originally added to to gasoline to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. However, corn requires 25% more fossil fuel energy to convert the corn to ethanol than the amount of fuel that it uses. The USDA and the Farm Bill has a long history of racial discrimination. They have been successfully and historically sued for discrimination and have had issued payouts to African American farmers, Latino farmers, Native American farmers, female farmers, and still the USDA is reported to provide 50% lower loans to African Americans than they do to white farmers. The current Farm Bill, 75% of it is for. I'm going to speed through this. I know I'm running out of time. It's for nutrition programs such as SNAP, which used to be known as food stamps. So 76% of the budget for the Farm Bill is from that. So the last Farm Bill was passed in 2018, and so the next one is expected in 2023. So it provides financing for grocery stores that open location in food deserts. They also, so this past year in 2020, the farm subsidies accounted for 39% of farm income. So the federal government is paying 39% of all income to farmers in different types of farm supports, including, of course, the pandemic relief. So the Farm Bill for 2018 had there were a number of improvements so that farmers can benefit from climate change friendly farm practices, including setbacks and other kinds of things for conservation. But again, this disadvantages Native Americans who know how to conserve land. They have techniques for growing crops, for example, in low water areas of the Southwest. Yet these types of practices that they have aren't recognized and aren't paid for by the Farm Bill. The U.S. government defines how you have to conserve in order to get conservation stewardship payments. So the system is also very inefficient. California is responsible for producing over 1/3 of U.S. vegetables and 2/3 of all fruits and nuts. And so they have to be transported around the country for U.S. consumers, refrigerated trucks, air freight, roadways. So the food system accounts for roughly 10% of the total energy used in the United States, and is a major and contributes to climate change. And in addition to that, there's still food waste. 30 to 40% of all food that's produced in the United States is wasted. You know, we produce enough food to feed everyone in this country, yet a lot of it is wasted. Some of it's because of expiration dates that really don't make sense. The food expires long before before it goes bad. So a lot of environmental justice food activists believe that the national food system goals should be refocused and that they should be considered to be national security and economic and public health that they should be focused to address national security as well as economic and public health, and that they should be targeted to restore and build the soil health and the natural ecosystem, to increase resilience, to improve nutrition, to increase water retention, and to achieve pollution reduction. The policy should also promote biodiversity, and they should become the economic foundation for rural areas. They also believe that the food system goals should be refocused to provide ecosystem services, which would play a role in increasing air and water purification, in increasing nutrient cycling, decreasing erosion, increasing flood control, and increasing carbon sequestration. So if we know how to do that now, we know how to change agriculture so that instead of being a carbon sink, that it, instead of using carbon, it can be a carbon sink. It can reduce the amount of carbon emissions in the air. And there are other things that we can do. We can support local food systems to increase access to fresh fruit and vegetables and better nutrition. We can eat less red meat and processed meat to reduce heart disease, methane emissions from livestock. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And conserve water and grain. We can also reduce food waste and redistribute it to those who need it. So I guess my voice, I should listen to my voice and I should stop here. So I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was an extremely informative presentation. And audience, please remember, if you have questions, you can place them in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we will get to those. Now I will turn us over to Julian.
Thank you, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Good?
Yes.
All right, great. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for inviting me to chat about water policy. I'm a water nerd. This is my favorite thing to do. So thank you for giving me an excuse to do it. My name is Julian Gonzalez. I work for Earthjustice as legislative counsel for the Healthy Communities team. What that means is I am a water policy lobbyist, which means I work with folks in DC to tweak, to brainstorm policies, to better improve our approach to water policy. I also work with communities from all over the country to try to be a tool for them, to amplify their voices, to give them opportunities to talk about and acknowledge their lived experiences, especially as it relates to water policy or water issues, water contamination, and just make sure that groups like Earthjustice, which is a large nonprofit environmental law firm that does advocacy, are aligned with communities and folks doing environmental justice work in those communities. A big part of my work is helping folks understand, both here in DC and around the country, that advocating for improving water policy should not be the sole domain of what I call traditional environmentalists. For a long time in this country, environmentalists and environmental groups like Earthjustice have looked a very particular way. They've been the same type of people from the same type of places and backgrounds, and that has in large part contributed to us being where we're at in terms of environmental injustice. And by partnering with community groups and organizations like NMA, working with people from different backgrounds and expanding the tent of who is considered an environmentalist and who is considered authoritative to speak on environmental issues. I think folks are seeing a bit of a new way forward in many respects here in DC. It's very much baby steps, but working with physicians and medical students, with kids, with folks who are not just, who don't just enjoy camping or who don't just work for Earthjustice is really the way forward. So that's why I'm really happy to talk to you all about water policy and how the way it's been shaped over decades has caused a disparate impact in communities of color and especially African American and Indigenous communities. Could we go to the next slide? Okay, thank you. So before we get into bigger picture stuff like examples of the many ways water policy causes public health harms disparately impacting communities of color, I just want to get down in the weeds a little bit and just set some background stuff on the table. This is going to get a little bit nerdy, so just bear with me for a few minutes. Water policy in our country is a bit odd. If you had to draw it up from scratch again today, you'd probably do it way differently. The first thing I'll point out is that in 2010, in the summer, the United Nations General Assembly explicitly recognized the human right to water and sanitation and acknowledged that clean drinking water and sanitation are essential to the realization of all other human rights. So it's like a preconditioned human right to other human rights, according to the United Nations. In many other countries, water is acknowledged as a right, either as part of their constitutions or part of their governing laws, but that's not the case in America. There's a really, really complicated series of interlocking factors that govern how we decide who gets water and what are the backstops to ensuring water is clean, and how much water costs to clean and things like that. And at the federal level, water, I see the comment in the chat, water is about to be publicly traded on the Dow Jones. Yeah, water privatization is, I could do a whole nother like half-hour thing on water privatization. It's no good. So there's two laws that predominantly govern water quality at the federal level: the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So those are loosely divided into the Clean Water Act regulating surface waters, your rivers and streams, lakes, tributaries, and things like that, and drinking water regulating what comes out of your tap, how it's cleaned, and some of the sources it comes from. Those two things are not neatly separated in real life, only in the law. So they impact each other very much. And that's kind of what I was getting at when I mentioned that that's not how you would draw it up. You wouldn't randomly separate drinking water from source water when they're so interconnected. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 after years of states essentially failing to have their own state level regulations governing and preventing water contamination. The combination of very high profile news events like the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catching on fire, and activism and a little bit of a burgeoning public consciousness on environmental issues was the impetus for the Clean Water Act to be passed, vetoed by the president at the time, and then overridden by Congress at the time. It was also around the same time a bunch of other environmental laws were passed. So it's no accident that all those things happened at the same time. The Clean Water Act's approach to regulating waters kind of revolves around different kinds of permits, different kinds of monitoring and evaluation of water quality, and a series of steps that states have to take and permittees have to take if they are going to pollute in the water. The permits from the Clean Water Act are essentially documents that give permission to pollute within known levels of within acceptable levels, big air quotes, acceptable levels of pollution into different water bodies. So you can see how that starting point is a little bit of a shaky foundation if your goal is to have all waters in the country fishable, swimmable, and usable for recreation by the mid 80s, which was actually the original written goal of the Clean Water Act. And needless to say, they did not reach that goal by the mid 80s. The Safe Drinking Water Act, on the other hand, regulates, like I said, it establishes minimum standards to protect tap water and requires owners of public water systems to comply with certain standards for regulating certain contaminants. That law was really revised in the mid 90s to incorporate some other assessments after some lawsuits that pretty much alleged that the Safe Drinking Water Act wasn't doing what it was intended to do. Like the Clean Water Act, states also play a very large role in enforcing the law, the Safe Drinking Water Act, in setting those standards for drinking water contaminants and things like that. In both cases, the EPA regulations serve as a baseline, and states can be more protective than them. A lot of states aren't. Some states even have laws on the books that legally prevent their state agencies from being more protective than EPA with respect to water policy. So there's a lot of complicating factors going on here. It's not a pretty picture. Second bullet point here, implementing agencies and implementing regulations. So water policy is usually the domain of the Environmental Protection Agency. Some other agencies are involved. For example, the Department of Interior has some regulations related to water quantity, how much water withdrawals and things like that, which is especially important out west, a little bit less so out east, unless you're in like Florida, Georgia, Southeast, then it's a little more important. Like I mentioned, the EPA sets a lot of the details in terms of the technical details in terms of what monitoring requirements are needed, how enforcement happens, what the standards are, approving state water quality standards, things like that. These agencies like EPA were designed because Congress, the idea behind agencies like EPA and other government agencies is that Congress does not have the technical expertise to make laws related to things that are science heavy, that require technical expertise. So agencies should exist to employ technical experts to execute the vision of both the president and of Congress. The problem is these agencies don't exist in a vacuum, right? All the same issues that have plagued the rest of our governments since the inception of this country plague agencies. They, for many decades, didn't have people of color in leadership positions or even in lower level positions. They did not have the proper procedures in place to ensure that they had engagement from communities that have not been engaged with by the federal government. Language access wasn't a priority for a lot of these folks. Rural access, rural outreach in communities of color didn't happen, especially for tribal communities, for decades and decades and decades. So all of these things factor into how agencies like EPA have regulated our water and dispersed funding to build water infrastructure for decades and decades. And all the historical racism, the systemic racism that afflicts things like farm bill policy, land use policy, like Mark talked about, banking policy, that all affects water policy as well. Can we go to the next slide? All right, water infrastructure and investments. So related to the actual laws and regulations, right, you have the issue of water infrastructure and investment or lack of investment in communities. Water infrastructure isn't something people think about, right? It's not like a highway. Highway, you know, the infrastructure sucks on a highway if you drive over it and there's potholes and construction and all of that. Most people use highways, right? And Rich people, poor people will use a highway, even though a highway is probably more likely to go through a poor neighborhood. Water infrastructure, on the other hand, is usually underground, right? You're talking about pipes. You're talking about sewage treatment plants and wastewater treatment plants, which I would wager to say most people don't know where their nearest water treatment plant is. They don't know how water gets treated or what that means, or they just know it comes out of the tap when they want it to, and hopefully it's clean. It's something that people take for granted unless it's not working. And when it doesn't work, it hasn't really been a newsworthy item for most of our country's existence, right? Even things like Flint come and go out of the news cycle, and Flint's still going, it's still happening, and we don't talk about that in the news, right? It's out of sight, out of mind. So water infrastructure, more so than other visible environmental infrastructure issues, faces that issue. And historically, certain communities have been left behind as our country's infrastructure investment pushes have happened. When jobs are, I'll give you an example. When decades ago in the South, you had more job opportunities in the West, and many African American communities were fleeing Jim Crow laws and segregation, and tried to find more opportunity out West in California. A lot of them headed to places like the Central Valley, but out there it was very similar in terms of segregation and the lack of availability of loans to Black families, and the only land that they could purchase was land that didn't have running water. It didn't have any sewage disposal, wasn't connected to larger towns or cities, and that was the only land that they could afford. So the investment happened in bigger communities that were predominantly white, and not those communities. And the infrastructure built in a lot of those poorer communities was more shoddy and remains in place now. Investment pushes did happen from the federal government, but it wasn't those communities that received the funding, because in order to apply for funding, if you're an organization or a person, that requires people, and a lot of the people implementing those federal infrastructure pushes didn't care about those communities, and that's how you end up with not only segregated neighborhoods, but also segregated water infrastructure. In the second bullet, you see some examples of the problem as it still exists today. A lot of EPA's current programs to help disadvantaged communities are loan programs, but a lot of these communities are smaller communities, predominantly Black or Indigenous or Latinx, and they can't afford a loan because the community at the local level doesn't have that much funding. So the availability of grants, and not only the availability, but the capacity of a community to even know how to get through the grant application process disproportionately impacts those same communities. And that's something that our federal agencies haven't really reckoned with until the last 10 years or so. And even now it's in the absolute baby steps phases of them trying to do analysis on exactly how much process inequities have impacted, have caused their programs and funding streams to have disproportionate impacts. On top of all of that, the last bullet here, federal investment has plummeted since the 70s. It's a fraction of what it used to be as a percentage of GDP. You're talking 10% of what it was in the 70s or something like that. And old investment, has maintenance costs and repair costs, and those costs, not just for highways and bridges, but also for water infrastructure, falls to your state governments and your local governments. And not only are those bodies often underfunded, but they're also, they also suffer from the same systemic structural racism that the agencies have had at the federal level, right? So if you have a bad governor who doesn't care about, Indigenous communities, they're not going to put what limited investment money they have towards the infrastructure on a tribal reservation unless they absolutely have to. So it's really a cascading effect of a bunch of different issues, which have caused really, really bad water infrastructure to be the norm in our country. The American Society of Civil Engineers does a report card on infrastructure in our country every few years, and water infrastructure has consistently, both drinking water and wastewater infrastructure has consistently gotten like D's and F's. It's pretty bad. Can we go to the next slide? All right. I will now stop talking about all the like wonky stuff and go a little bit more high level. So in this slide, there's a picture of a book and a woman, the author of the book, Catherine Coleman Flowers. If you haven't heard of her, I would definitely recommend that you Google her. She's an environmental justice advocate and a champion, and somebody who I'm very fortunate to work with. She's from Lowndes County, Alabama, in rural Alabama, a place that has been afflicted by really, really terrible lack of access to sanitation, to sewage sanitation. So in these communities in Alabama, you have old septic tanks, which are essentially waste disposal tanks underground, either under your house or under your yard, to store sewage, right? When you flush the toilet, things like that, when you put water down the sink. Not every community is connected to a sewer system where it goes to a waste treatment plant, and all that, especially in rural areas. And this community has been disinvested for decades and decades, and it's over 90% Black folks. And in this community, the problem is so bad with these septic tanks because of the unique soil conditions that they have there, that when it rains, sewage backflows out of the tank, sometimes into folks' yards and into folks' basements. And there's nothing they can do about it because it can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $18,000 to fix a septic tank, which this is a poor community and they don't have that kind of money. This is not something that they have. The folks in this community, like Catherine, have been fighting this issue for years, and it's fallen on deaf ears largely. So it's not for lack of effort of the people dealing with the issue. It's for lack of caring for the people here where I live in Washington, D.C. These communities, they're not far from a sewage system, about a mile or two out, but they're not connected. And the reasons are because of what I described earlier, the way infrastructure investments happen or don't happen to reflect racial composition of different communities. There's a car manufacturing plant that's been around for a long time, not too far from Lowndes County, and they're connected to the sewage treatment system because it's a big car company. And these folks, though, are not. A lot of them, because the septic tank doesn't fail, because the septic tank fails, they have to create a homemade pipe system, PVC pipe, that goes from the tank to a yard across the street, or a pond in their neighborhood, just homemade. It's called straight piping, and it's awful. And nowadays, climate change is making all of that even worse, right? With extreme weather events and changing soil conditions. So that's the sort of ways that these problems manifest for actual communities. And what happens on a public health level is you have situations that are utterly unforeseen by medical communities, by policy communities. Lowndes County has been dealing with hookworm, which has been largely eradicated around the world because of the conditions of the soil, the extreme weather events, and the amount of bacteria and sewage in their water. And the local Alabama Health Department denied it for some time. Lawsuits, which is how Catherine ended up working with Earthjustice. Lawsuits and a lot of public pressure finally caused acknowledgement that some of these illnesses that you shouldn't expect to be as prolific as they are in this county have flourished because of the conditions. And a lot of the times, on top of all of that, if you have a small, say you say you're a rural community that does have a small waste treatment plant, which is the case in a lot of communities. It's not always septic tanks. You have responsibilities, and those small rural waste treatment plants are regulated by the Clean Water Act, but you don't have enough people or resources to properly maintain it. And all of a sudden you're violating the Clean Water Act. So now you've criminalized this community being poor. So that's kind of the way that all these things, the laws, the regulations, the lack of engagement, the historical disinvestment all come together and really harm communities. Can you go to the next slide? That's a picture of a young man from that community. Standing on top of a pipe going from the backyard of their home into the yard. Can you go to the next slide? I don't have a lot of time yet, but I just wanted to flag some other examples really quickly. Stormwater flooding. Stormwater is what happens when it rains in a place that has a lot of surface area that's concrete, right? So like cities, parking lots, streets, and things like that. All the dust, dirt, garbage that's on there doesn't just disappear, goes down the drain or goes, downhill until it reaches a water body. And that's a lot of bacteria and contaminants. It affects, you guessed it, communities of color in urban areas. CAFOs, a regulation of big ag. Lobbyists existed back when the Clean Water Act was passed, and they got large exemptions for agriculture. So now the Clean Water Act doesn't properly really regulate a lot of discharges from large agricultural operations. So there's different parts of the Clean Water Act that imbue that same historical racism. So happy to talk more about this, but I know I'm over, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark and Julian. Those presentations were so enlightening and informative. And I wish we had time for questions. Unfortunately, we don't. But gosh, this would have been some great discussion, but your information was so beneficial to all of us. So to our audience, I apologize for us not having questions, but I hope the information was beneficial to you. Before you leave, we're going to place our evaluation link in the chat. If you take just a moment to click on that link and provide some feedback, we'd greatly appreciate it. We would like to thank our sponsors, Johnson & Johnson, the Energy Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their generous support of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program and of this webinar series. This now concludes this session. Please have a wonderful day.